You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Florida's budget is just over $115 billion, so when Governor Ron DeSantis vetoes about $500 million, it doesn't sound like much in comparison. But if your agency or group was banking on a few $100,000 for generators or, say, $1 million to protect against hurricanes, it feels like a lot. Coming up, we'll talk with reporters Meghan Bowman and Douglas Soule from the Your Florida team. They'll explain what the governor vetoed and what survived, and some of the new laws you might need to know about. Well, Douglas, let's start with you. A couple of big numbers are floating around about the budget. $115 billion. I've also seen the figure $117 billion. Can you kind of explain the difference there?
You know, in terms of the $117 billion figure, DeSantis in that count is including back of the bill material. In terms of the $115 billion figure, they're not. And that's the broadly reported figure, $115 billion. Regardless, and this is the most important point here, we do know that this budget is smaller than the year before's.
Right.
And that's something you're going to hear lawmakers talk a lot about in the weeks and months to come.
Got it. All right. Now, we're going to talk about vetoes in a bit, but first let's go over some of the highlights and what they mean for people in Tampa Bay. Now, all session, DeSantis was talking up tax relief, but he didn't get a property tax break he pushed for. So what kind of tax relief can families expect, Douglas?
Well, I think first and foremost, it should be pointed out that businesses were probably the big victor in terms of these tax cuts. The biggest chunk of the tax cuts went to eliminating the business rent tax. That actually generated some controversy, with some voices saying they wanted to see more direct family cuts. But those in charge said the tax savings would trickle down to families working for those businesses. The tax package also included yearly tax holidays for hurricane and back-to-school supplies. There are also permanent tax exemptions set for things like bug sprays, sunscreen, life jackets, and more. Later this year, you can also expect a one-time tax holiday for hunting, fishing, and camping supplies.
Now, some other highlights from the budget include salary increases for teachers and law enforcement. There's also some money for Everglades restoration, some other environmental projects too. Douglas, what stands out for you?
Yeah. So there was money set specifically aside for certain professions like first responders and teachers, though, across the board, state employees got a 2% pay increase. There was some negotiations between the legislative chambers that would have had that at more. Ultimately, they settled on that 2% figure, which is still notable considering the fact that this budget is less than last year's, but it's also notable considering inflation is so high. In terms of the environmental side of funding, you mentioned it yourself. A lot of money is involved in this sector. Environmental project funding is a mixed bag, I'd say, compared to last year's, especially when you consider the local projects Governor DeSantis vetoed. A lot of water quality projects got sliced, for example. But let me point you to one interesting area that also came up. It involves the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That corridor lets the state buy land for the purpose of preservation. The legislature this year clawed back $200 million from the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It was supposed to, go back into the general revenue fund. DeSantis vetoed that, meaning that the money is still going to that area. While DeSantis hasn't always been loved by environmentalists, there's been a lot of controversies. I think people sometimes forget that he has advocated and funded a lot of conservation projects.
Yeah, and the wildlife corridor is important for species like the Florida panther, which is, a severely threatened animal, beloved by a lot of Floridians. So that is important. Now, outside groups have varied opinions about this budget. Florida Tax Watch called this a responsible budget. The Florida Policy Institute, on the other hand, says it's a budget of missed opportunities. Just kind of break that down for us, Douglas.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you compare the takes of these two groups. Florida Tax Watch, for example, releases an annual list of budget appropriations it finds questionable. The group definitely leans toward a fiscal conservative fiscal policy viewpoint. The group says that the governor's vetoes covered more than half of the items they mentioned on the list this year. Usually it's around 3/4 of the list, though. But regardless of that fact, the group believes the budget in its entirety is not perfect but responsible. Mind you, it's, as mentioned, smaller than last year's. Now, the budget was a done deal. I also talked to the Florida Policy Institute, as you mentioned. That group is definitely more progressive leaning, and they're definitely not near as big of fans of the budget. They say there are a lot of underfunded things in Florida right now. I mean, most Florida prison housing units don't have AC, for example. The Florida Policy Institute says the budget, smaller than last year's, definitely doesn't really raise revenue in severely underfunded areas.
Yeah, no AC in the heat of Florida summer is something to think about for sure. Well, your Florida team has been chatting with Floridians about the legislative session since the session started way back in March. Let's take a listen to what some of them say. Here's Timothy from Bay County reflecting on what was a pretty divided session.
But we elect people in office to make sure the checks and balances are there so we can make sure one personality doesn't take over the whole entire idea process and ruin everybody else's life in the process. We live in a republic. We don't live in a democracy. We should have different things like Democrats and Republicans, but we can't say the Republicans are awesome. I'm a Republican. We can't say they're awesome, and we can't say Democrats are crap or Democrats are awesome and Republicans are bad. Because if we do that, what are we doing? We're dividing the house. We're dividing again. We're not unifying under the same daggum flag.
All right, so interesting thoughts there from Timothy. Meghan, you've been chatting with Floridians, for the last 6 months or so. What does this tell you about how people are feeling about how lawmakers get things done in Tallahassee, or maybe how they don't?
Frustrated.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people I talk to, I heard, why can't they get along? I mean, we hear on this national level, right, like this partisan thing. I mean, things are divisive, but for the most part, from people I hear from in the state of Florida, Floridians just want common sense. They just want people to do what they're supposed to do. Get in there, do your job.
Well, here's another comment from Lynn Miller in Ocala. Let's take a listen.
They're just, as far as I'm concerned, missing the mark. Instead of doing good for the majority of their constituents, they just, ping-pong on these stupid things like banning fluoride, which benefits millions of people, and they really don't do anything of substance.
All right, so Lynn brings up an interesting point talking about the statewide fluoride ban. That was one law that went into effect at the start of July. I mean, what should people know about this law and how it could affect them? Douglas.
I mean, that the impact of that law is kind of simply put. It bans fluoride, a cavity-preventing mineral, from tap water, specifically from public water systems in Florida. That's something that many communities across Florida and across the nation, for that matter, have had in the water supply for decades. And that's something that obviously, going on a week now, is no longer the case in the state of Florida. That's one of numerous laws that were passed during the 2025 session that took effect on July 1st.
The fluoride thing is interesting, though, because a lot of Florida counties and cities had already opted out of putting fluoride in their water supplies. I mean, you can go to the Department of Health website and look at a list of the counties, as of July that were still fluoridating their water. So what is the sort of background to this movement against fluoride? Because it's not just in Florida, right?
No, it's certainly not. And Florida was actually the second state to take this level of action, Utah being the first. I think many listeners may have heard RFK Jr. of the Trump administration's stated concerns about fluoride. They came about, the time of the 2024 general election, and they've since been amplified under the Trump administration. Conservatives in Florida have taken up those concerns that high levels of fluoride can cause health problems. You also heard from Governor DeSantis that fluoride consumption should be a choice, and it's something that people shouldn't have forced in their water supply. Now, dental groups avidly maintain that low levels of the mineral, which, low levels are what were in the water supply, are healthy for Floridians, and that removing it from the water supply could create a negative dental health environment.
Right. Just because you have access to fluoridated toothpaste doesn't mean that everybody is in the same circumstances there. I want to talk about some more laws, but before we do, let's just go back to Lynn for a moment. Meghan, she talked about people ping-ponging around and not doing things of substance. I mean, what is your sense of what she's getting at here in terms of what she wanted lawmakers to do and kind of what came out of that session?
Well, from a lot of people I've spoken to since March, even before the session began, a huge topic of concern was property insurance. So at least, with Lynn, she saw a lot of those type things that would affect, your home, your daily life. And so she was thinking that there might be some stuff going on with that, right? that didn't really happen. A lot of the big news came from these stories like fluoride, like the bear hunting.
Right.
Some of these other types bills, according to Lynn, right, these aren't what Floridians needed done right now.
Right. So big headlines, but not necessarily dealing with some of those kitchen table issues.
Right. Some of the things they're dealing with every day.
Yeah. Douglas, aside from the fluoride ban, what else do people need to be paying attention to as far as new laws which were signed into effect or which went into effect July 1st?
Certainly, and I'll kind of add to what Meghan said. It's kind of interesting that I'm not going to be mentioning one related to property insurance. Property insurance is something that got a lot of chatter from lawmakers at the beginning of session, but as she mentioned, we're now talking about a different set of laws that passed. Another one of them, a set of them, for example, formally recognizes the Gulf of America. Another new law that took effect as of a week ago, July 1st, prevents law enforcement from stopping boats for random safety inspections. I kayak quite a bit in North Florida, and I can tell you, especially on holiday seasons, I see many boats pulled over for these random safety inspections, and I think the thought of undoing that was that it created maybe unnecessary friction between law enforcement and boaters. Also in effect right now is a condo reform package aimed at reducing costs, and there are also now increased anti-squatting measures and park protections.
All right, so some of those are going to have a material effect. Douglas, have you ever been pulled over to make sure you've got your life vest on or enough paddles in your kayak or anything?
I haven't been, but I have friends who have. Certainly safety is important.
Indeed. You're listening to Florida Matters. You're hearing from Douglas Soule and Meghan Bowman with WUSF's Your Florida team. A conversation about Florida's budget and what it will do for Tampa Bay area communities and who misses out continues when we come back. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. You're also hearing from WUSF reporters Douglas Soule and Meghan Bowman. They're covering state government and how it affects you and your neighbours. Now, normally there's a bit of breathing room between the end of the legislative session and laws taking effect. Not this year. Republicans have a supermajority in Tallahassee, but party lawmakers were not on the same page. And that meant the session dragged on for weeks and weeks after it was supposed to close. The budget passed at the last minute. Governor Ron DeSantis signed it with less than a day before the new fiscal year kicked off. Lynn Miller in Ocala shared her thoughts with WUSF's Your Florida team. Here's what she said.
So there's going to be a lot of turmoil, but in my decades of experience, the pendulum swings one way, then it swings another way, then it usually comes back to common sense. So that's what I truly hope will happen.
All right, so Meghan, as you were saying before, this is something that you heard from a lot of folks you talk to. They really want to see lawmakers focused on things that are going to make their lives better.
So there was a very cool thing that did happen this session, and it was with the state parks. So last year there was a lot of pushback when there was a move to build golf courses, pickleball courts at some of the state's parks. This year, a bunch of those, protesters, I guess you would say, kind of got together and they created love fests at these state parks. So they really came together, and it kind of moved the legislature to make sure that that didn't happen again. And so that is one bill that did pass. So that, there are some good things, but like Douglas had said, Lynn talked about the Gulf of America. Why? Right? That was something she asked. Why are we focusing on this when, we could be doing on this, you know?
Yeah, the state parks, that was kind of a rare moment of bipartisan unity. I mean, when that was, I suppose, leaked in a sense to the press, there was a huge outcry, a lot of pushback across the board, Republicans and Democrats alike lining up and saying, not in our state parks. And
it was like a cool thing, right? Seeing the people stand up together and getting that movement, heard, and legislators listened, and that bill passed.
Yeah. Now, Douglas, Lynn talked about a lot of turmoil in Tallahassee. Just remind us of the feud she's talking about, because the governor may have signed the budget, but he still wasn't happy with a lot of legislators. So just unpack that for us if you could.
Oh, yeah, certainly. There's a lot to unpack here. There's been a lot of political infighting this year, a lot. The most dramatic displays of that fighting were between House lawmakers led by House Speaker Daniel Perez and Governor Ron DeSantis. What didn't they fight about? Let's see. I mean, I know a big topic of contention was the governor wanted a property tax rebate this year, while the House wanted an across-the-board sales tax, and neither ended up happening. That's just one of a myriad of different conflicts that publicly emerged between the House and the governor. I can tell you, I mean, it was really almost surreal watching House lawmakers publicly speak against a governor they largely walked in lockstep with in past years, preceding Governor Ron DeSantis, running for president.
Yeah.
But that certainly wasn't the only divisions we saw this past session. The House and Senate also got into it a bit. They didn't see eye to eye on how deeply to cut taxes. Senate President Ben Albritton had concerns that if the cuts went too far in the tax department, it'd be harder to fund critical services down the line.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest factor that slowed down budget negotiations and led the budget to be signed shortly before a government shutdown deadline.
Yeah. Meghan.
Yeah, like Douglas said, there was so much back and forth between property taxes versus sales taxes. Which one do you want? A lot of the people during session that I spoke with around the state said they didn't want either. There were a few people I spoke to when talking about the property taxes. Some of their main concerns were what happens if those go away? What will fund those services that property taxes pay for? So there were a lot of, Floridian input, at least to me, that were saying, wait a minute, we want these services. Why would we take this away? We're already a low tax state.
Yeah. Of course, we should mention, too, the investigation into Hope, Florida, and that sort of entangled Governor DeSantis' wife, Casey DeSantis, too. So things got a little personal there, too. But I wanted to talk a little bit about money for law enforcement. Now, this is something that Governor DeSantis touted as part of the budget, but at least one group said they needed more. Let's take a listen.
So when the question arises, where's the money for the highway patrol? Are troopers satisfied? That's almost a sarcastic question. Are they satisfied? Not even close.
Now, that's Spencer Ross, president of the FHP's Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 198. He said a 10 to 15% pay raise just isn't enough. Let's get a little more of the backstory here. Dade City Republican Representative Randy Meghan said troopers should shift money they already have to cover pay raises.
Now, running a business, if my overtime is $10 million, I think I got a problem.
And that was at a budget subcommittee hearing back in March. And here is Spencer Ross's response.
Yeah, you're right. But guess what? If you demanded that your employees did 3 or 4 other jobs or 4 times more, you would pay them more, right? And if you saw if your employees were overworked, guess what? You would hire more employees. So yes, Mr. Representative, we do have a problem. And the problem is that the legislature is not addressing it. The problem is, we'll just sprinkle a little bit of money and guess what? 6 months from now, we're going to have the same conversation, but it's going to have a totally different tone.
All right, so Meghan, why is Ross essentially saying troopers deserve an even bigger pay raise?
They're being asked to do more and more and more without having that adequate compensation raise, right? Ross was telling me that he hears from a lot of people who are going out and essentially working second jobs. So they'll do 40 hours a week on the job, and then they have to get off-duty hours and kind of supplement that. The base pay for a trooper is right around $54,000 a year. In the state of Florida, the living wage for one adult is around $50,000. You add one child, like in Miami-Dade County, you add one child to that, it increases to $84,000. So, they're feeling that. Yeah. Ross mentioned that, for people who live in like one of the state's fiscally strained counties, it's harder to find that off-duty work. So then they can't even get that extra to supplement it.
Yeah. And of course, you hear from teachers year in, year out. I mean, they're having to take on extra jobs. In summertime especially, then they're another group that did get a pay raise, but they would probably say it's really not enough. Well, the governor's veto pen revealed that the fight with legislators wasn't over. Douglas, who bore the brunt of those vetoes?
So it should be pointed out first and foremost that there's less vetoes this year than last year. That being said, there's still 13 pages of vetoes. First off, he cut nearly 400 million in mostly local projects. We're talking about money for museums, after-school literacy programs, and so much more. I talked to a group called the Florida Policy Institute, and it did a little bit of a breakdown. It says the largest share of those vetoes, about $175 million worth, targeted things like local transportation projects, water quality improvements, parks improvements, and federal energy programs. Education projects received the second largest cut. DeSantis also redirected money with his vetoes back into the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and he vetoed $750 million that was supposed to go into the state's rainy day fund in the future.
Also, interesting to look at some of the money that did go into hurricane resilience and then money taken away from those local projects too. And you saw some of that in Tampa Bay, right? So, for example, in Hillsborough County, they had some money set aside for generators that got taken away. How do you kind of square up those two different things?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, hurricane resilience projects are an important thing. We're in hurricane season. The last couple of years have given us rough ones, and this year could too. On a statewide funding basis, hurricane resilience definitely got funded, but there's also this more local perspective. And in the 13 pages of project vetoes, DeSantis included some cuts to things like stormwater and infrastructure local projects. I know actually just read a story about the disappointment felt by some local officials in Volusia County over such vetoes. That area, got flooded during recent storms and wanted to minimize the chances of that in the future. And I know that Tampa Bay also saw millions of project cuts too for hurricane response and resiliency projects. So certainly a lot of disappointment statewide at the local level for budget vetoes. But that being said, that was the case last year as well, when the governor vetoed more projects than he did this year.
Yeah. Well, arts funding got ripped down to the studs last year. Some people were concerned about cuts this year too. Here's Kim Tuttle in Gainesville.
Yeah, I think it was short-sighted. And it's not just this one time. It's an overall impression I get from leadership. I mean, and like it goes from California to Florida. It goes from north to south. It's everywhere. Once one person starts doing it, everybody joins the bandwagon. Let's cut the arts. Let's cut the arts. Let's cut the arts.
Meghan, tell us a little more about Kim and her concerns.
Yeah, so Kim Tuttle is based in Gainesville with Dance Alive National Ballet. They were up for $475,000 in this budget. That obviously got vetoed. So you mentioned like last year, there was a huge cut, right? $32 million in arts funding was cut in the state of Florida. Now this year is substantially less, right around like $1.5 million. But her company was one of the ones that were vetoed. So with that money, they were planning on building a new center to teach music and dance for, children and adults at an affordable price to get it into the community. And obviously, that was cut.
Yeah. What about other things? I mean, there was a veto for the Ybor City Cuban club renovations. Anything else kind of jump out at you about arts vetoes?
Yeah, sure. There was $375,000 for the Tampa Museum of Art. That got cut. Murakami Museum and Japanese Gardens. I'll actually be speaking with them soon down in Delray Beach, but they were also cut for $500,000. When we talk about what Kim said with the arts, a big proponent of, why she was so concerned is because of what the arts can do for people. There have been scientific studies that show dance can increase kids' scores in science and math. I mean, there's all this research of the positives of dance, and she mentioned that it can be almost defeating, right? When you put this in originally she went for $3.5 million for this to build that building. Senate and the House went back and forth, and finally got it down to $475. But that's a big chunk of change that she's going to lose.
Yeah.
And that would have done a lot for that community, and that's what these arts groups can do.
Yeah. And let's not forget it's a business too, right? I mean, these are businesses. They're putting, food on the table for people because they're paying employees. So it's a big part of the economy.
It is. And, Kim and I, it's funny you mentioned that. We did talk about that. She mentioned we are already burdened as artists, and as artists, we don't make a lot of money. And I have to vouch for that as somebody who spent 20 years in the arts community as a dancer and choreographer. That's true. You don't get into it because you want to make a ton of money. You get into it because of the passion and the love, and you want to create. And so that was something that she said that can be a little bit defeating, but hey, they're still going to go out there and push, and they're still going to get what they can to raise this money. So even though her funding got vetoed, she said that's not going to let it stop her.
Well, the legislative session is in the rearview mirror, but lawmakers will be back in about 6 months to do it all over again. In the last 30 seconds or so we have here, what are you going to be paying attention to in the lead up to the next session?
Well, right now there's quite a few things that have happened federally that might impact the state. So for the moment, I'm going to be focusing on what impacts the big, beautiful bill will have on Floridians, more specifically SNAP cuts and Medicaid. Past that, I'll be going to South Florida to look more into this new condo law. I'll also be looking into an update from last year's public sleeping ban, and we'll see kind of how that's impacted folks around the state.
And Douglas, what about you?
Yeah, so taxes were the talk of the town this past session, and I think it's going to be the talk of the town in the state for that matter, leading up to the next session. Governor Ron DeSantis is loudly calling for lawmakers to target the property tax. And the lawmakers, specifically on the House, are looking into ways to do so. So how that unfolds, we do not know. Obviously, a lot of local governments get a lot of funding from the property tax. And just to note that any change to the property tax would have to be approved by voters through a constitutional amendment. So DeSantis wants something to be put on the 2026 ballot, making a change.
Well, that's Florida Matters for this week. You've been hearing from reporters Meghan, Bowman and Douglas Soule from the Your Florida team about what the governor vetoed and what survived in the 2025 budget and what happens next. Thank you, Meghan.
Thanks.
And Douglas, thank you for your input as well.
No, thanks for having us on.
Now, before we go, we could use your help on an upcoming show. Summer is heating up. We're going to take a closer look at the danger of extreme heat and what you can do to keep yourself safe. Share your tips for beating the heat or your biggest concerns. Leave a voicemail. The number is 813-755-6562. That's 813-755-6562. Florida Matters executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Blake Bass. Subscribe to Florida Matters wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on WUSF's YouTube channel. I'm Matthew Petty. Thanks for listening.